All right, let's get started. I'll let you talk at your tables here in a minute or two. Let's start with prayer. God, thank you for your blessings. Thank you for your church, and thank you for this church and the opportunity to participate together. I'm thankful for Wednesday nights and just that midweek rush, that recharge and opportunity to come together in community and gather around your word and fellowship. And so thank you for the opportunity tonight. Pray that you'll bless upstairs and with the kids, with Tony as he talks about stewardship, and those of us that are gathering here in this room tonight. God, give us clarity as we go through the other signs on signs, shadows, and the substance of Christ. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I did not finish last week, so let me catch up what we did not cover last week. I'm going to pass through it pretty fast, or try not to, but we ran out of time last week before we could finish the feast calendar. Somebody help me remember, rather than calling them feasts, what is a better word? Appointed times, all right? Sometimes the word feast can be a little misleading in our English. And so appointed times, these are times that God appointed for the people to gather and remember. Very similar to what we do on Sundays. It's our appointed time that we gather, remember, worship, celebrate. So the seventh and the final appointed time on the Levitical calendar is the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, which is in contrast to the Day of Atonement 5 days earlier. It is the most joyful feast of the year. 5 days after the Day of Atonement, 15 through 21 Tishri is the Hebrew calendar. So for 7 days, every Israelite family lived in a booth, or a tent, or a dwelling, a temporary shelter made of branches. The Torah was specific about how the roof of this temporary dwelling needed to be made. It had to be sparse enough to see the stars through it at night. Families ate all their meals in the sukkah in Jerusalem. The entire city was transformed for the Feast of Booths. Booths on every rooftop and every courtyard along the streets. It was a big deal. Deuteronomy 16:15 says it twice. You shall be altogether joyful. So if Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, was Israel's most solemn day, then Sukkot was its most celebratory day, and they come back to back 5 days apart. That emotional range of that sequence is in and of itself a type of formation, from the most sobering day of the year to the most joyful in less than a week. So three things held together in this 1 7-day observance called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. There was historical memory. What would be the historical element? Why did they meet in these dwellings? The booths kind of reminisced the wilderness. Yeah, reminisced the wilderness. When Israel had no permanent home, when God himself traveled with his people in a tent. So there was historical memory. There was present gratitude. The final harvest of the year was in. The agricultural cycle was complete. The land had yielded all of its produce. And so it was a time of celebration. It was a time of gratitude because the harvest was in. And then the third element was more of a forward-looking anticipation. This is what makes tabernacles kind of an irreplaceable memorial because the temporary shelters communicated something that couldn't be missed. Anybody want to make a guess? Or it might be on your notes. What's the future anticipation? Okay, God dwelling with us permanently. That's a piece of it. Jesus' return, which tells us this present world is not our home. Yeah, this is a temporary. This situation that we're living in is a temporary situation. The temporary shelters communicated the world is not the final home. We're pilgrim people. So don't become too attached to your houses, your stability, your permanence. Something more permanent is coming. So the Booths said every year, you are not home yet. Now, as we see with several of the appointed times or appointments that God made by the Second Temple period, these celebrations evolved. Things were added to them. Two ceremonies had developed around the tabernacles that carry direct New Testament weight. Each morning of the feast, a priest would come and draw water from the pool of Siloam in Jerusalem and would carry it in procession to the temple, where it was then poured out at the altar while the crowd sang and celebrated. So it was a prayer for rain, yes, but it was also a forward-looking ceremony anticipating the river of living water that we read about in Ezekiel 47, Zechariah chapter 14. Where are we? I am not even on the right slide. There we go. Turn over to John 7, 37 and 38. And whoever gets there first, read it for me. John 7, 37 through 38. Catch it? So they are celebrating the Feast of Tents. And this second temple practice, not the Mosaic practice, but this second temple practice that's been added in where they're praying for rain, but they're also it's also symbolizing the living water. Jesus stands at this feast and he positions himself as the fulfillment of what that ceremony was all about. The living water flowing not from a pool, but from himself. The second ceremony, they would put 4 enormous golden lampstands in the court of women. That was one of the courts, the outer courts of the Temple Mount, the court of women, which was as far as women were allowed to go on the Temple Mount. And they'd have these golden lampstands, and they were lit on the first night of the feast. And these lampstands would illuminate all of Jerusalem in the old city. And so John 8:12 follows immediately in John's narrative after the tabernacle exchange. So somebody read John 8:12. Does that kind of add dimension to, I mean, we read these verses, but when we start realizing, oh, wait, these are the ceremonies they're practicing at this time, and then Jesus stands right there in the midst of them and says, I am the living water. I am the light of the world. And he's basically saying, what you're celebrating here is me. Yeah, it's me. Both the water and the light, both ceremonies pointing forward. So Jesus is claiming to be the substance of both on the same feast day. So somebody turn over to Revelation 21, verse 3. This goes to what Dana mentioned earlier. Revelation 21, verse 3. So God will pitch his tent with all of humanity, not temporarily, not symbolically, but finally and fully and forever. And so this feast of tabernacles, this feast of dwellings, the feast of tents, the Sukkot, was always saying, you're not home yet. And then Revelation 21 says, now you are. Now you are. So that completes the feast calendar, or the appointed times calendar. 7 appointed times, 1 calendar, 1 story. And as it's told in the year-shaping practice to a people who didn't yet know the name of the one that it was about. So let me take us back to our mission statement for the series. God gave his people signs that were always meant to point beyond themselves to the substance that was coming. And that substance, his name is Jesus. All right. So the feasts organized Israel's calendar year. But there were other signs that organized Israel's body permanently. Their weekly rhythms, their closets, their cupboards, their fields, their tables. So tonight we're going to look at 3 of those signs, and we might touch on some of the others later when we come back next week to kind of tie all these together. But let's start with circumcision. Circumcision, where this is a sign, a permanent sign of the body. So circumcision inscribed in flesh. Sabbath shapes the week. Dietary laws organize the table. So there's 3 signs, all 3 doing the same kind of work that the feasts were doing. They were forming a people toward a reality that the signs themselves couldn't produce, because Jesus is the substance of that. But they were also setting these people apart from the world around them. And this I find very interesting, because it really hasn't been until probably, it's been my ministry years, really the last 40 years or less, maybe on the coasts of America. It happened longer ago than 40 years, but to my memory of my 50 years in the church, it's really been happening for the last 30, 35 years, where we stopped trying to be separate from the world in the church as the church body, and we've tried to exercise our liberty. We've tried to exercise our conscience to look just like the world, but still be the church. And throughout history, that's not really ever happened until recently in American years. And so I find it really interesting. Now, the thing that has always been the problem is majoring on the external signs without the internal work. That's always been a problem. Jesus dealt with it with the Pharisees, but we're going to find out tonight that goes back to the Old Testament. That wasn't even just in the New Testament. So same mission, different signs. So the sign that God chose. Genesis chapter 17. Somebody turn there, read verses 9 through 14 for me. Genesis 17. 9 through 14. All right, it's pretty direct, right? God appears to Abraham at 99 years old, and he establishes the covenant sign. Every male in the household at 8 days old is to be circumcised. This is the sign of the covenant. An uncircumcised male would be cut off from the community. So before we do anything else with this text, I want you to feel the weight of what God chose to do here, all right? He didn't choose a piece of clothing that you could take off. He didn't choose a dietary practice that you could observe or skip. He didn't choose a feast that you attended once a year. God chose a sign, a permanent alteration of the body, inscribed in the most private place. A sign that went everywhere you went, a sign that could not be removed. It was cut into the flesh of an 8-day-old child, male, before he could consent to it or understand it. That's a pretty specific choice, right? And God made it deliberately. He didn't go, I got it. Let's do this. That'll be fun. This was deliberate. It's a specific choice, a deliberate choice, and it communicated something very specific. You belong to this people. Your body tells the story of the covenant that I have made with Abraham. This identity is not a preference. It's not a lifestyle. It is literally cut into your flesh. Every Israelite male walked through his entire life carrying the covenant sign on his body, in his body. When he woke up in the morning, when he went about his daily work, when he slept at night, the sign was there. Not on a shelf, not on a calendar, on the body. And here's one more dimension of what God chose that deserves to be said here. God chose the organ of procreation. And that wasn't just a coincidence. It's not because no other location would do. The covenant sign was inscribed at the precise place in the male body where new life is transmitted. Which means every child born into the covenant community would be conceived through circumcised flesh. Generation after generation after generation, the continuation of the covenant people would pass through a body bearing that covenant mark. Now think about what that communicates. The sign wasn't only about the man who bore it. It wasn't only about just the man. It was about every life that would come through him. Now, procreation was a matter of bragging rights in these cultures, in the ancient cultures. It was a matter of bragging rights. And so God said, I'm going to put my mark on that. Every conception is going to be through my covenant with my covenant people. The covenant reached forward into every child, into every generation, through the body of the man who carried the sign. Reproduction and covenant belonging were joined in the flesh at the most fundamental level. Now, this all throws light, and I think kind of comic light, at one of the most striking moments in Abram's narrative. Romans 4:19 tells us that Abraham considered his own body as good as dead. He was 100 years old. The very organ through which the promised seed would come was the one God had marked with the covenant sign, and then asked to trust beyond all physical impossibility. The sign of covenant belonging was inscribed on the body that had no natural capacity at 100 to keep the covenant's promise. And then God kept the promise anyway. Isaac was born through circumcised, dying flesh by the power of God alone. So the sign and the promise were joined in the same body, in the same place. Got it? When he was circumcised? I'll have to dig that up. It's a few chapters before. Yeah.
Because you went to Romans 19 is what triggered my brain there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So here's what I want us to see.
At the beginning of chapter 17, though, it says he was 99.
Right.
Am I missing something between that question?
Well, no, he was 99 when they conceived. When was, because when God appeared to Abram, he was younger. I don't know how much younger. Because when God appeared to him and when God circumcised Abraham and said, out of you is going to come many nations, it wasn't questioned. It was just like, oh, okay. And then they took matters into their own hands, and Hagar and Ishmael. And then the visitors came and said, oh yeah, you're gonna have a child. And Sarah laughed. And yeah, so there was some time span there. So Ishmael was born before Abraham was circumcised. I don't think I put that in the timeline right. Right. Yeah. But they were both beyond childbearing years. Yeah. Yeah, very good. Good question. So here's what I want you to see. It's the most important thing this series has to say about all three of tonight's signs. The critique of circumcision as an external sign that we see in the New Testament, the argument that the sign was always meant to correspond to something internal, that doesn't begin with Paul. It doesn't begin with Jesus. It begins with Moses. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. So again, we're talking about the critique of circumcision as an external sign. Just being circumcised. That wasn't argued first by Paul. It wasn't argued first by Jesus. It was argued first by Moses. Deuteronomy 10:16. Somebody read that. Circumcise the foreskin of your heart. The sign in the flesh is pointing at something else. And that the something is here, the heart. Devotion, surrender, love for God. The outward sign was supposed to correspond to an inward reality that the sign itself can't produce. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. Goes a little further. God himself will circumcise your heart. Future tense. It's a promise. Moses isn't saying try harder to achieve heart circumcision. He's saying there's a day coming when God himself will do the inward work that the outward sign was always pointing to. So the sign cut into Abraham's flesh in Genesis 17 is within the Torah itself describing or described as pointing forward to something God will do in the future. A heart transformation that the outward sign cannot accomplish. So it's not a New Testament argument. It's Moses inside the Torah, inside the Pentateuch, telling Israel this sign is pointing somewhere beyond itself. And then it goes deeper. Somebody turn over to Ezekiel 36. Ezekiel 36, 25 through 27. It's pretty clear, isn't it? That's what the sign circumcision was always pointing at. I'll sprinkle clean water on you. I'll give you a new heart. I'll remove the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I'll put my spirit within you. I will cause you to walk in my statutes. Not pay better attention to my laws, not more careful maintenance of the outward sign, a heart transformed by God himself, which is exactly what Deuteronomy 30 promised. So now flip over into the New Testament, Romans chapter 2. Romans 2, 28 and 29. So Paul gets a bad rap. There are people that try to describe Paul, there are some people that reject Paul as a writer of the New Testament. They just reject his writings. People will say, I read Jesus, I don't read Paul. I think they're idiots. But one of the reasons they reject him is because they think Paul's saying something different than the rest of the Bible's saying. Paul's not departing from Moses here. He's reading Moses. He's saying, Moses told you this. Deuteronomy 30 told you this. Ezekiel told you this. The inward reality was always the point. The sign was always pointing here. And then Colossians 2, 11 and 12, which we'll look at more next week, describes what has happened in Christ as a circumcision made without hands. The circumcision of Christ, accomplished not with a knife, but by the Spirit in regeneration and union with Christ in his death and resurrection. So the sign that God inscribed in Abraham's flesh has arrived at its intended destination, and it is Jesus. All right? So now, before we go to table discussions, none of what I've just said tonight is an argument against circumcision as a medical practice. All right? Or a cultural practice for Jewish believers. We're not disputing that it still happens and it can happen and it does happen. We're not saying it shouldn't happen. Paul himself in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 16, which I think is pivotal because it's after Acts chapter 15, which is a huge chapter that we're going to talk about next week, the Jerusalem Council. But after the Jerusalem Council, when they say, hey, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. In Acts chapter 16, Paul himself circumcises the young man Timothy, his protege. Right after the Jerusalem Council says, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. We're not going to force that issue. It's not a big deal. They're Gentiles. And then in Acts chapter 16, he circumcises Timothy. Not as a requirement. Why did he circumcise Timothy?
So they get in the synagogue.
Yeah, because they wouldn't let him get in the synagogues and teach if he was uncircumcised. Which, by the way, Jesus, and we'll talk about this later, Jesus did not have to come back if all you had to do was be circumcised to follow the law. That practice was already in place. Gentiles could already they could convert to Judaism in the Old Testament. All they had to do was be circumcised and follow the law. So there was already a provision for Gentiles to become Jews. We didn't need Jesus to come and die and resurrect for that to happen. But Paul circumcised Timothy because he needed, Timothy was going to be going into Jewish communities and ministering. Timothy had Jewish history on his mother's side, but his father was Gentile. And so he was uncircumcised until his youthful young adult years when Paul took a rock and circumcised him, a sharp rock. So Paul's argument, built directly on Moses, is that circumcision cannot function as a mechanism of covenant belonging now that the substance has arrived. And he's going to talk about that in Galatians chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. If you receive circumcision as a means of your standing before God, he says, Christ is of no advantage to you. Why? Because that process was already in place. You could already be circumcised and become Jewish. The problem is not the sign. The problem is misunderstanding what the sign was always for. Make sense? All right. I am 15 minutes late for table discussion number 1. Go for it. Question 1, question 2. Does God hate women? Yes. Why didn't God give women a sign? Why only the men? He gave the promise of the covenant to a man, to Abraham. Oh, because he needed reminding more. Okay? So he's the initiator. He carries the seed. Women aren't going to bear children without the seed of men. And they couldn't marry outside of their people. So why did the woman need a sign if the man already had one? There you go. All right. Let's move on. 2 more signs. Sabbath. Sabbath, the rest. The rest that was always pointing. So the Sabbath is unique among the 3 signs tonight for one reason. It carries 2 rationales in the Torah itself. And each one reveals something different about what the day was for. And so sometimes you might hear 2 different reasons. Both are true. You can't make an argument for one and not the other, because both are true. Exodus 20, verse 11. Somebody read Exodus 20, 11. So in 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, God blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. The Sabbath is rooted in the pattern that God himself established at the foundation of the world. It reflects something true about the rhythms of existence: work, rest, labor, renewal. That's built into creation before Israel ever existed as people. All right? So it comes from creation. God blessed it and made it holy. And so we're reminded in Exodus 20 to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. Somebody turn over to Deuteronomy 5:15. There's a second reason for the Sabbath, a rationale for the Sabbath. So it's a memory of redemption, right? It's a memory of their rescue from Egypt. You rest, why? Because you're no longer a slave. It's a, remember this, keep it holy. You rest because God acted. So you rest because God rested, and then you rest because God acted. The day is a weekly, embodied reminder, I'm free. I was not always free. The God who freed me says, take a break. 2 rationales, both of them real. Neither one is about the day for the day's own sake. The day is always pointing at something. So remember Jesus arguing with Pharisees. They were arguing for the sake of the day and making it about the day for the day's own sake. It's always pointing at something. It's always pointing at the pattern of God's own creative work, rest, labor, renewal, and the act of God's redemptive rescue of his people from Egypt. So watch what the prophets do with this. Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah 58. Again, this doesn't get disputed first in the New Testament. It gets disputed first in the Old Testament. Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. All right, so Israel's fasting. They're observing the appointed times. They come to God wondering, why aren't you noticing? And God's response is this: you observe the day while pursuing your own interests, while your heart is oriented around yourself rather than around me. The sign's present, the reality that it's pointing at, genuine rest in God, trust, reorienting your life around Him, remembering your redemption, that's absent. You're just going through the motions. You're making it all about you. By the way, before you get too hard on the Israelites, we do it too, don't we? How often do we sing the songs we enjoy? And we don't sing the songs we don't enjoy. I don't really like that song. Too bad, it's not about you. Oh man, worship was really good. I was really getting into worship today. It was amazing. Why? Because it pleased you? Sometimes Daniel and I get into arguments because he stands there. I don't. He stands there and watches you guys sing. And he'll do a song 2, 3, 4 weeks, and he goes, they're just not getting into it. I'm struggling to keep using it because they're just not getting it. It's not about them. It's not about them. Does the song glorify God? Now, again, that doesn't mean we just keep doing it to spite you, but this isn't a New Testament critique. It's Isaiah telling Israel what Moses already implied in Deuteronomy 10. The sign without the heart that it points to is empty. Now go to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4, 9 and 10. When you got it, read it. All right? The weekly day of rest was always pointing towards something the day that itself could never fully deliver. A rest found not in just stopping physical labor one day in 7, but a rest in the finished work of Christ. A rest from the works they had been doing all along that was pointing to the finisher, the author and the finisher of our faith. Entered by faith, not by the calendar. And go to Colossians 2, 16 and 17. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. The weekly Sabbath is on Paul's list alongside the feast calendar as a shadow. It's there's shadow, there's substance. The day was always pointing at the rest that was coming, and the rest has arrived in Jesus Christ. Now, there's some practical questions about Christian Sabbath observance, and we're going to talk about those in week 5 when we talk about new covenant markers. But tonight, the goal is the pattern and how the prophets critique, how the New Testament critiques, and how we arrive at the substance. All right. So we will get into that. We'll talk briefly about Seventh-day Adventists and why they hold to a worshiping on the Sabbath versus worshiping on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, and why do we worship on the first day of the week? All right, so that's the brief on Sabbath, and again, we'll unpack Sabbath a little more next week as we talk about the substance and what that means. But let me give you a brief overview on dietary laws, dietary code. Again, we're not going to go into great detail. Hopefully, toward the end, there will be time for some questions. Not the end of tonight. I doubt there will be time, but hopefully as we get to the end of the series. So the dietary code, there's permitted animals, those that both chew the cud and have a split hoof. That's allowable. There's permitted fish, fish with fins and scales. There's specific rulings on birds and insects, and the rationale stated in Leviticus chapter 11, and then it's repeated again in Leviticus chapter 20. But let's go to Leviticus 11, 44 through 45. Leviticus 11, 44 through 45. All right, so these dietary distinctions were serving one reason. Be holy, for I am holy. Be separate. It was setting them apart from all the people around them, all the pagan, godless people around them. Every meal, every day required a choice. This is permitted, this is not. The table became a place where they were being formed as God's people. You couldn't sit down to eat without being reminded, I belong to a holy God. I belong to a holy God. My life is organized around that distinction. What goes into my body is not a neutral question. That's what God was forming in them. But the dietary laws were also doing something else. They were boundary markers, signs of distinction between Israel and the surrounding nations. Israel didn't eat what Egypt ate. Israel didn't eat what Canaan ate. The table was a visible daily marker of who you belong to. Every meal was a declaration of your identity. Is that true today? Is that true today of our practices? And again, I go back to sometimes it seems like we try to see, we have a tendency to ask questions of how close can I get to the world? Music. I like this worldly music. How close can I get to that and still be holy? If we just change the words, I like this style. I like this rhythm. I like this beat. I want to keep doing this. Dress the way we dress. How close can I like this form of clothing? Yeah, that's enough. I'll stop there. Isaiah 29:13. What do the prophets say about this? Isaiah 29:13. Read it when you got it. Isaiah here, the dietary code lands right in here. This people draws near with their words. They honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Holiness was never primarily about the food. The food pointed at holiness. Holiness was never primarily about the food. When the table was observed meticulously and the heart was far from God, the sign had been severed from what it was always pointing at. And Isaiah pointed that out. It didn't take Jesus. It didn't take Paul. There are two passages often brought into this conversation. Mark chapter 7, Acts chapter 10. We will hit them next week. We will carry that into next week. Some interpreters read Mark 7 and Acts 10 as a departure from the dietary code in Leviticus chapter 11. Mark 7 is a controversy over ritual hand washing. It's not a ruling on Leviticus 11. Jesus is confronting the Pharisees, their oral tradition about defilement. His argument is that defilement comes from the heart, not from what enters the mouth. And he makes the argument, what enters the mouth goes through the digestive system and comes out the poop shooter. It's clean. It's been cleansed. It's more about what's in your heart. That's the argument Jesus makes. He's not saying all food is clean, all right? Jesus would not have said that in Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. Acts chapter 10. This one, by the way, careful interpreters read both of these passages both ways. They're not definitive. I've told you where I land. They're not definitive. Acts chapter 10, I struggle with a little more. It's the sheet, the vision with the unclean animals. It's given, and then Peter gives an interpretation of it himself. And God basically brings animals down in this vision and tells Peter to eat the unclean animals. And Peter's like, I can't eat the unclean animals. I'm Jewish. You know that. And God says, don't declare unclean what I have declared clean. And then Peter then interprets his vision. And Peter doesn't ever say, let's eat pig. It's not his interpretation. He doesn't apply it to the dinner table. He applies it to Cornelius. God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. The vision uses food as the vehicle, but Peter's conclusion is about Gentile inclusion, not dietary reform. Does that make sense? In that culture, Jews called Gentiles animals. They called them unclean. This vision of using these unclean animals to tell Peter, go to the Gentiles, would have probably made all that sense in the world and never communicated to Peter, go eat some pork. It's okay now. Now, here's my struggle with that. I lean to that interpretation. My struggle with it is I have no idea why God would have used unclean animals and told Peter to eat them, while at the same time telling him, I'm not telling you to eat these animals. But I'm not Second Temple Jewish culture. I don't relate to it. So I'm not saying that it's not an abolishment of the dietary law, but I would stand in a position I don't think it is, because Peter never said it was. That was not his interpretation of it. Peter saw it as, hey, God told me to go to the Gentiles and not call them unclean. And that was his interpretation. So I'm not gonna resolve those texts tonight, and we don't need to resolve them to understand the dietary laws and what they were doing or where they were pointing. We'll come back to that, the question of Gentile freedom from the Dietary Code in week 4. And I'll use a completely different passage to pose that. I think it's pretty clear. But for tonight, here's the pattern to carry with you. The holiness of the dietary laws were forming Israel toward distinction, toward consecration, toward an embodied awareness of belonging to a holy God that was always pointing at something the food itself couldn't produce. Now, people will make arguments about hygiene. They'll make arguments about shrimp and shellfish being the filters of unclean waters. They can make those arguments. I will make the argument that if you're having health problems, some of the first things your doctors will tell you to stop eating are pork and shellfish. And so those two things can be true at once, though. And so I'm not making that argument, but even by the way, like the dietary laws of mixing milk with meat. That wasn't a Mosaic law. That was a rabbinical law added later. And it was taken from one verse in the Bible. So y'all know that Jews use separate pans and dishes for milk products and meat products. They don't mix them. Anybody know what verse they take that from? Yeah, you don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. And basically it'd be the same thing as don't make chicken and eggs. You don't bring life and death together in the same pot. So that was what was being said there, but that was very specific, and they broadened it. The rabbis in their teachings broadened it. So and even when you get into the mixing of fabrics, linen and wool, don't mix linen and wool. If you look at the priestly garments, they mix linen and wool for the priestly garments. So there are exceptions to those things. But again, it's always pointing to something the food itself couldn't produce, a transformed heart, a life genuinely oriented around God's holiness, an inward reality that the outward practice was meant to reflect and reinforce, which is exactly what we found Jesus teaching all the way through the Sermon on the Mount, right? And that's what we talk about baptism, right? The wedding ring. It's an outward expression of an inward commitment, an inward covenant that's already been made. Baptism does not save you. A wedding ring doesn't make you married. When I walk, I take my rings off. When I go to the gym, I take my rings off. They sit on my desk. I find I go about half the day every day now without my rings. It doesn't make me unmarried. I'm not trying to communicate to all the guys that I'm working out around that I'm free. It's a symbol of my love for my wife, but taking it off, putting it on doesn't make me married, and taking it off doesn't make me unmarried. And same thing with these. So we're gonna take these questions into week number 4. What happens to these signs when the substance arrives? So I'll give you a couple minutes and go to table discussion number 2 to carry out the evening. Question 3 and 4, if you can get to them. You got about 3 minutes. All right. My apologies for talking 40 miles a minute. I have so much ground I want to cover, and I really don't want this to go to a 12-week series. So I'm finding that I'm trying to talk way too much. So my apologies for that. But it is 8 o'clock. I need to let you go. God dismiss us with your love. Thank you for your word. And thank you that it provides clarity where clarity is needed. Dismiss us now with your love in Jesus' name. Amen.